Welcome to one of the most disturbing events ever to happen in the Ozark Mountains. Before we get started, please let me know where you are and what time it is when you are listening to this narration. We want to know what places and times of day or night these written accounts reach. In 1908, Thomas Holloway, a well-known cartographer from Springfield, Missouri, went into the thickly wooded hills of the Ozarks to map out land that had never been mapped before for the United States Geological Survey. He was going to spend 3 weeks making a map of the area between Taney and Stone counties. A man with his level of experience should have been able to handle it. The USGS's official report from November of that year said that Holloway had not come back from his trip. His camp was still there, his gear was still there, and he had almost enough food. The only person who was missing was Thomas. The report didn't say anything about the leather-bound notebook that was found among his things. The entries in the notebook got more and more disturbing as the pages went on. There was never any official record of the journal. Records found in 1963 show that the agency supervisor thought it was not suitable for public record and then locked it away in a regional archive in Jefferson City. Elias Burkhart, who owns a general store in the small town of Garber at the foot of the mountains, was the last person known to have seen Thomas Holloway alive. Burkhart told local authorities that Holloway looked calm and collected as he bought supplies for his trip. He said he wanted to camp near what locals called Stillwater Hollow, a quiet valley about 12 miles northeast of Garber that is known for being even quieter than the rest of the Ozarks. The following is a story put together from Thomas Holloway's recovered journal, interviews with people who lived in the area after he went missing, and newspaper archives from 1908 to 1912. Some of the information has been confirmed by Geological Survey records that were made public in 1963 after the Missouri Historical Society asked for them. If it weren't for what happened to the people who went looking for Thomas Holloway, his disappearance might have been just another sad story that people forgot about in the backwoods of America. In 1908, Thomas Holloway was 37 years old and had been married for 3 years. His wife had died of tuberculosis. He didn't have any kids. His co-workers said he was very careful, quiet, and completely dedicated to his job, doctor. William Barrett, Thomas's boss at the USGS, said that Thomas had an almost supernatural ability to see geographical features that other people might miss. This skill made him very useful for surveying areas like the Ozarks, where the thick forest canopy and uneven limestone formations made mapping hard. In 1908, the Ozarks were still one of the most remote areas in the continental United States. Even though railroads had started to reach some parts of southern Missouri, there were still many areas that could only be reached on foot or horseback. People in local communities lived in relative isolation and were often suspicious of people from outside. The hills themselves were old mountains that had been worn down by millions of years of erosion. They made a landscape with steep ridges, hidden valleys, and cave systems that looked like mazes. Even experienced woodsmen could get lost in the thick stands of oak, hickory, and pine. The state of Thomas Holloway's campsite when a search party found it 10 days after he went missing was what made his disappearance so strange. Webster County Sheriff Ambrose Coleman's report said that everything seemed to be in perfect order. He set up the tent correctly, arranged his bedroll neatly, and kept his surveying tools safe from the weather. Someone had made a pot of coffee, but they never poured it. His rifle was still leaning against a tree, not fired. There was no sign of a fight, an animal attack, or a quick exit. It was like Thomas Holloway had just walked away from his camp and disappeared. His journal, which was open on top of his bedroll, was the only thing that was out of place. The last entry, from the 17th of September 1908, said, "The woods are quiet today. Too quiet." Something is watching from the hollow. His co-workers said that his handwriting was usually neat and methodical, but it got more and more messy as the entry went on. Thomas had been keeping detailed records of his work for days before this last entry. Coordinates were written down, landmarks were described, and geological features were listed. But starting on September 12, his writing changed in a small way. He started writing down notes about the valley's strange sound properties as he was mapping it. He talked about how sound seemed to travel differently there, how sometimes his footsteps echoed when they shouldn't have, and how other times they didn't make any sound at all. He observed the lack of avian vocalizations at midday, a phenomenon that any naturalist would identify as anomalous in a thriving forest ecosystem. By September 14th, he had started to write about things that bothered him at the edge of his vision and movement that stopped when he looked directly at them. These notes were mixed in with technical notes about changes in elevation and rock formations, as if Thomas was trying to stay professional even though something was starting to bother him. After finding the abandoned camp, Sheriff Coleman set up a more thorough search and brought in experienced trackers from all over the county. Even after searching for miles over rough ground, no sign of Thomas Holloway was ever found. There was no blood, no clothes, no body parts, or anything else that could tell what might have happened to him. The sheriff's report didn't say anything about the strange behavior of the tracking dogs, but a personal letter to his brother in St. Louis later revealed this. This letter, which was found in 1959 when the Coleman family estate was being settled, says that the dogs wouldn't stay on the same path when they were tracking. They would get angry, go back to their own trail, and then sit down and howl in a way that I have never seen in 30 years of law enforcement. By the second day of the search, the dogs had become so wild that they had to be brought back to town. If it weren't for Professor James Wickham, a geologist from Washington University in St. Louis, who came to the area in early 1909, the disappearance might have just been a local curiosity. University records show that Wickham had been in touch with Holloway in the months leading up to his disappearance to talk about strange geological features in the area. He was supposedly there to study the karst formations that are common in the area. It wasn't common knowledge that Wickham and Holloway had been classmates at Yale about 15 years before. Wickham set up a base in Galena, which is about 20 miles from where Holloway was last seen. He hired local guides and spent a few weeks looking around, especially in Stillwater Hollow and the area around it. Wickham had an assistant with him, a graduate student named Edward Mercer. Holloway did not have an assistant. They gathered samples, took pictures, and did what Wickham called acoustic experiments all over the valley. On the 23rd of March 1909, Wickham and Mercer went deeper into the hollow than they had ever been before. Their guide, Harlan Thatcher, said that the two men were becoming more and more interested in a limestone formation that the locals called the Whispering Wall. It was a curved rock face about 40 feet high that seemed to capture and change sounds in strange ways. Thatcher said that he had told people not to stay near the formation after dark because of local superstitions. When authorities asked him more questions, he didn't want to say much more. He only said, "People around here don't go to that place. Animals won't go near it either. There's a reason for that." It seems that Wickham and Mercer didn't care about these worries. They told Thatcher to go back to their base camp and get ready for dinner while they took their last measurements. Thatcher said that this happened around 4:30 inches the afternoon. He was worried when they didn't come back by nightfall, but he didn't want to go back to the formation in the dark. He went back to the site at dawn and found it empty. Their things were still there, with notebooks open and instruments set up as if they were being used, but there was no sign of Wickham or Mercer. Thatcher went back to Galena right away to tell them that someone was missing. The search that followed took almost 2 weeks and found nothing. People paid a lot more attention to the disappearance of 2 educated men from St. Louis than to the disappearance of a single surveyor, the street. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote a number of articles about the case, suggesting that the men might have gotten lost in a cave system that wasn't on any maps or been attacked by locals who were angry. A journalist named Frederick Palmer went to the area to look into it and wrote a series of increasingly sensational articles that suggested that dark forces were at work in the remote hills of southern Missouri. Palmer found a journal kept by Edward Mercer during his investigation that was missed during the first search. However, this information never made it into his published articles. This journal, which was found among Palmer's personal belongings decades after his death, had notes that were eerily similar to those of Thomas Holloway. Mercer wrote about strange sounds and sights that were just out of reach of the senses. He talked about how Wickham had become unhealthily obsessed with the hollow's acoustic properties, spending hours recording and analyzing how sounds behaved there. Mercer wrote on March 21, just 2 days before they went missing, "Professor W. insisted today that he heard voices coming from the rock face. I heard nothing, though the silence itself seemed somehow expectant. He pressed his ear against the limestone for nearly 30 minutes, nodding as if in conversation. When I asked what he heard, he said only, "They know we're here now." His expression was hard to read. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of resigned recognition. People stopped being interested in the case after a while. The university looked into the disappearances on its own, but in the end, it called them a tragic accident, probably because a cave collapsed. Families got money from their insurance. Respectful obituaries were published in academic journals. By the end of 1909, the issue was thought to be over. The things that happened in Stillwater Hollow had mostly been forgotten by the public, but in some parts of the Ozarks, the disappearances had only made people more wary of that area. People in the area, who were never very open with people from outside the area, became even less willing to talk about the hollow. Hunters stayed away from it, and trappers went around it. Timber companies were starting to cut down trees in the area, but for some reason they left that valley out of their plans, even though it had mature hardwoods. Carl Denman's interest in the case might have kept it that way forever. Denman was a private investigator from Kansas City who was known for solving strange disappearances in the Midwest. Elizabeth Wickham, the professor's sister, hired him in the spring of 1910 because she was still not happy with the official explanation for her brother's disappearance. In April of that year, Denman came to Stone County. He spent a few weeks talking to people in the area, reading official reports, and slowly putting together what happened in both cases of missing people. Denman's investigation was different because he was methodical and took the local people's folklore and superstitions seriously. Denman understood these stories as a type of cultural memory, ways of encoding real dangers into cautionary tales that could be passed down through the years. Others had dismissed them as the foolish thoughts of isolated hill people. One of the stories he heard was about the Stillwater Silence, which locals said had been happening in the hollow since before white people came. These stories say that the valley's strange quiet wasn't just a lack of sound, it was something more oppressive, a silence that pressed on the ears and made a man's thoughts too loud in his head. Some older people said that hunters who went into the hollow came out different, becoming quiet and withdrawn, and sometimes talking to themselves in voices that weren't quite their own. Denman was especially impressed by how similar these stories were from communities that didn't see each other very often. The same themes kept coming up: the eerie silence, the feeling of being watched, and the distortion of perception. These things lined up too well with what Holloway and Mercer wrote in their journals. On the 18th of May 1910, Denman went into Stillwater Hollow himself with a local guide named Josiah Wendell. Wendell was in his 70s and said that his grandfather had been part of the first European settlement in the area. Wendell said he would take Denman to the hollow, but he wouldn't go in himself because he had promised his mother on her deathbed that he would never go there. Denman, unlike other investigators, brought an Edison phonograph with him so he could record the strange sounds that the journals talked about. As Wendell waited a little way off, he set up his gear at the edge of the hollow. Denman's notes, which were found later among his things, say that he made several recordings at different places as he made his way deeper into the valley toward the limestone formation known as the Whispering Wall. Only bits and pieces of evidence tell us what happened next. Wendell said that after waiting for Denman for several hours, he heard a single gunshot echo through the woods. He was worried but didn't want to go into the hollow, so he went back to the nearest settlement for help. They put together a search party, but a sudden storm made them wait until the next morning to leave. When they finally got to the hollow, they found Denman's tools spread out near the bottom of the Whispering Wall. His phonograph was broken, and the cylinder recordings were gone. His notebook was open, and the last entry ended mid-sentence. The recordings, when played back, had something underneath the sounds of the forest, a rhythmic pattern that sounds like speech, but not in any language I can identify. The locals may be right about this place. There is something here that... About 200 yards from the scene, Denman was found standing perfectly still in a small clearing. People who found him said he didn't respond to their calls and was staring at a point in empty air. He didn't respond when they got close. He moved when they took his arm, but he didn't say anything or acknowledge their presence in any way. Denman stayed in this state of not responding even after he was brought back to town. A doctor from Branson was called in and found that the patient had acute catatonia of unknown origin. The doctor said Denman should be sent to the state hospital in Nevada, Missouri, because he couldn't figure out what the best treatment was. Records from that place show that Denman stayed in this catatonic state for about 7 weeks. His mental health had gotten a lot worse by the time he finally started to respond again. He could talk, but people said his speech was disjointed and hard to understand. When asked about what happened in Stillwater Hollow, he got very upset. Dr. Harold Winters, the hospital's head doctor, wrote down Denman's most coherent statement during this time on the 12th of July, 1910. "The silence isn't empty, it's full. Full of them. They've been there so long, waiting in the stone, listening through the stone, speaking through the stone. They learned our words from listening to us. They're learning how to use our voices, how to call with familiar sounds. Don't listen when someone you know calls your name in the hollow. It isn't them calling." Denman stayed in the hospital until he died of pneumonia in 1913. They never found the cylinder recordings he made in the hollow. The Missouri Historical Society later got his investigation notes, which the hospital had taken as part of his personal effects. For decades, though, they were mostly forgotten in their archives. After these events, Stillwater Hollow got an even worse reputation among the locals. People slowly left the few settlements that were close to the area. In 1915, a timber company tried to cut down the trees in the valley, but they ran into strange problems. Equipment broke down, workers got lost, and one experienced lumberjack had a complete mental breakdown, saying that the trees whispered back when he hit them with an axe. Maps of the area had been redrawn by 1920 so that they no longer showed the hollow. In the words of local guides, it became a place between the lines. People who needed to know about it did, and those who didn't were sent somewhere else. People in the area talked about the disappearances of Holloway, Wickham, and Mercer less and less over time. They were sometimes told as cautionary tales around campfires, but not very often during the day. This intentional lack of clarity may be why scientists didn't look into the hollow for many years. In 1947, the area got attention from outsiders again when Dr. Raymond Foster, an acoustical engineer from the University of Arkansas, found out about the site while studying natural amphitheaters in the Ozark region. Foster was only interested in science. He was an expert in the study of strange sound phenomena and had written a number of papers about naturally occurring sound anomalies in North America. Foster took a different approach to the hollow than his predecessors. He brought a lot of equipment and 3 helpers with him. He didn't know about the other disappearances because they had never been linked in any academic writing. Foster thought that the locals' unwillingness to talk about the area was just an anthropological curiosity, a sign of how closed-off rural communities can be. The Foster expedition got to the area in June 1947 and set up a base camp about 3 miles from Stillwater Hollow. Their presence made a lot of people in the area very uncomfortable. Foster's notes say that they had trouble hiring guides, and the ones who did agree to work with them wouldn't go into the hollow or stay in the area after dark. Foster and his team spent 2 weeks doing detailed sound tests all over the valley, with a focus on the limestone formation that earlier researchers had called the Whispering Wall. Their results were never published in a peer-reviewed journal, but Foster kept them in his field notes. In 1964, his widow gave the notes to the University of Arkansas archives. These notes talked about a number of things that went against the usual rules of sound. Foster called the hollow selective frequency absorption. When sound was projected into the valley, some frequencies completely disappeared, while others were amplified beyond normal levels. What was most strange was that he recorded what he called delayed acoustic returns, sounds that echoed back much later than physics would predict, sometimes minutes after the original sound was made. Foster's notes from June 24th say this: "The limestone formation seems to have resonant qualities that no other natural structure has been documented to have. When struck with a tuning hammer, it produces overtones that seem to come from within the rock itself, rather than from its surface. Frequency analysis shows patterns that almost look like vocalization, as if the rock were trying to mimic the sounds directed at it." Matthews, one of his assistants, has jokingly suggested that we are teaching it to speak. Of course, this idea is ridiculous. but it does capture the strange feeling one gets when working with this formation. Foster's notes had changed a lot by July 1st. His scientific detachment gave way to more personal observations. He wrote about the team's persistent auditory phenomena during quiet times, whispers that were just out of reach of their recording equipment. He said that 2 of his assistants had started to have trouble sleeping and strange dreams in which they talked to people who weren't there. Foster himself said that he became unusually obsessed with the hollow's sound qualities and would often go back to the site alone in the early morning when the forest was at its quietest. He called these solitary trips perception experiments, and he would sit still for hours, listening to the silence. The last entries in Foster's field journal, which were made on July 7th, show that his scientific methods have gotten a lot worse. He talked about breakthrough moments when he thought he could hear through the stone instead of just against it. He said that the silence in the hollow was pregnant with consciousness and that he had begun to communicate with what he called the observers. Foster told his team on the 8th of July, 1947, to go back to their university with all the data they had gathered. He said he needed to stay behind to check some of the results. He promised them he would follow them within a week. When he didn't come back by July 20th, a search was set up. They never found Foster. They found his last camp, which was right next to the Whispering Wall, still standing. Next to his sleeping bag was his open journal. The last entry was unfinished. It makes perfect sense now, the math of it, the patience of it. They've been waiting for someone to understand, to really listen. They've been so alone for so long. I can hear them clearly now, not just with my ears, but with the university said that Foster's disappearance was an accident, most likely because he got lost in the rough terrain. His research papers were put away. His acoustical findings, which were ultimately deemed inconclusive and methodologically flawed, were never published. The hollow went back to being purposefully hidden. The area around Stillwater Hollow became part of the Mark Twain National Forest in the middle of the 1,950 seconds, which meant that the federal government was in charge of it. Forestry Service maps from this time period show the area as unstable terrain, survey incomplete, which makes it less likely that people will visit on their own. Park rangers who work in the district are said to have been told unofficially to keep hikers and campers away from the area because of worries about dangerous sinkholes and unstable limestone formations. This could have gone on forever if Marion Ledbetter hadn't become interested in the area's mysterious disappearances. Ledbetter was a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Missouri in 1962. He was writing his doctoral dissertation on Ozark folklore. He found mentions of Thomas Holloway's disappearance while looking through county historical records. He found links to the Wickham Mercer case and, eventually, to Carl Denman's investigation through more research. Ledbetter was a careful researcher who spent almost a year gathering evidence before going to the site. He asked for sealed records under the Freedom of Information Act, wrote to historical societies, and talked to older people who still remembered what happened. He slowly put together the pattern of strange events and disappearances that had been happening in Stillwater Hollow. Ledbetter, on the other hand, knew everything there was to know about the Hollow's past. He knew what had happened to the people who had come before him. In a letter to his faculty advisor dated April 1963, he wrote, "There is a clear pattern to these events that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Each investigator has followed a similar trajectory. Initial scientific curiosity, giving way to obsession, followed by behavioral changes, and ultimately, disappearance or psychological breakdown. The consistency suggests either a genuine phenomenon worthy of serious study or an elaborate form of regional psychosis that has perpetuated itself across generations. Either possibility merits thorough investigation." Ledbetter went to Stillwater Hollow on the 12th of June, 1963. With 2 other graduate students who were well aware of the site's history. They had modern recording devices, cameras, and tools for taking geological samples. They set up rules to keep things fair and agreed to leave right away if any team member started to show strange psychological symptoms. Their research went smoothly for the first 3 days. They wrote down the hollow's acoustic properties, confirmed some of Foster's findings about sound anomalies, and made a map of the Whispering Wall's exact size. Their recordings showed nothing strange that couldn't be explained by normal sound waves. Ledbetter wrote in his journal that many of the things that earlier researchers had reported might just be the result of suggestion and isolation. This is because the human mind tends to impose patterns on random stimuli when it is in a new place. But on the fourth day, the team's photographer, David Summers, said that when he listened to audio recordings from the night before, he heard what he called voices in the static. Ledbetter and the third team member, William Cartwright, couldn't hear the voices that Summers said he could hear. Even when the recordings were turned up and filtered, this disagreement made things tense in the group. Ledbetter's notes say that Summers became more and more insistent. He ended up spending hours listening to the recordings with headphones and making timestamps of when he said the voices were clearest. On the sixth day, Summers stopped helping the team with their research and instead spent long periods of time sitting by the whispering wall and pressing a microphone against different parts of the limestone surface. He is said to have gotten defensive when asked about his behavior, saying that Ledbetter and Cartwright were missing something important because they weren't really listening. Ledbetter decided to end the expedition because he was worried about these events and remembered what had happened in the past. At first, Summers refused to leave, which led to a heated argument that Cartwright wrote about in his personal journal. Eventually, Summers agreed to leave, but only after he had copies of all the audio recordings for further study. When Ledbetter got back to the university, he wrote down everything that happened on the trip, including his worries about Summers' behavior, which he thought might be similar to what had happened in earlier studies. He suggested that any future research at the site be conducted under stringent psychological supervision, with consistent assessment of all participants. 2 weeks after coming back from the Hollow, Summers dropped out of his graduate program. He got a job as a sound engineer at a radio station in Springfield. Later, his co-workers said he was becoming more and more obsessed with background noise and subliminal messages. He suddenly quit his job in January 1964 and went back to the Ozarks. His landlord said he was missing in February of that year because he hadn't paid his rent. They eventually found his car on a Forest Service road about 5 miles from Stillwater Hollow. Even though a lot of people looked for him, Summers was never found. Ledbetter was deeply affected by this news, as he had just started putting his research together for publication. He stopped working right away and instead put together a full report of all his findings, which he sent to both the University of Missouri and the United States Forestry Service. Ledbetter wrote this document, called Acoustic Anomalies and Psychological Effects in Stillwater Hollow, a recommendation for restricted access, to explain the full history of events that have happened at the site and formally suggest that it be closed to research and recreation. The Forestry Service quietly put these suggestions into action, maybe because they knew they could be held liable if they didn't. By 1965, the Hollow had been officially designated a research natural area. This meant that access was very limited, and any strange events that happened there were not officially recognized. Interest in the site from academics slowly faded. Ledbetter himself gave up on his dissertation topic and instead finished his PhD by studying Appalachian folk medicine traditions. The most recent recorded event related to Stillwater Hollow took place in the fall of 1968. Bradley Compton, a freelance journalist who had read Ledbetter's report while doing research at the University of Missouri archives, became very interested in the history of the Hollow. He went into the restricted area in late September without asking for permission and brought recording equipment and a camera with him. Compton had told his editor at the Kansas City Star about his plans, promising to write an article about either a real scientific mystery or a strange case of mass delusion in the area. He thought the investigation would take about a week. After 3 weeks of no contact, his editor called the police. They set up a search, but they couldn't find any sign of Compton. No one ever found his campsite. His car, which was parked at a trailhead a few miles from the Hollow, only had his travel bags and a notebook that explained how he planned to do his research. The disappearance got a lot of media attention for a short time, but it was eventually blamed on getting lost in rough terrain. There weren't many connections to the Hollow's historical pattern because most of the records were either sealed or spread out across different institutional archives. The Kansas City Star ran a short obituary in December 1968 that said Compton was thought to be dead after going missing while working in southern Missouri. What wasn't widely known was that a package with Compton's audio recordings and a handwritten note arrived at the newspaper offices in November of that year. It was postmarked from Springfield, Missouri. The editor who got the recording said that all they had was the sound of the forest and some equipment noise. The note, which handwriting experts later confirmed was Compton's, said, "It's not in the recordings. It never has been. You have to be there to hear it." Stillwater Hollow has been officially off-limits for decades since then. People don't talk about it much anymore, but there are rumors among hikers about a valley in the Ozarks that rangers won't talk about and maps don't make clear. Every few years, academic researchers find new pieces of the pattern. A mention of Holloway's disappearance here fosters acoustic studies there. The whole story, though, is still spread out across many archives, institutions, and local historical societies. Not as well known is that the United States Geological Survey did a secret study of the Hollow's limestone formations in 1973. The Defense Department was interested in naturally occurring acoustic anomalies for possible use in surveillance technology, so this study was done under the pretense of evaluating mineral resources. The team followed strict rules, only allowing each person to be on the site for 4 hours at a time and requiring daily psychological evaluations. Their findings, which were made public in part because of a 1997 FOIA request, said that the limestone of the Whispering Wall was structurally unique and had unusual crystalline formations that seemed to resonate at certain frequencies. The report didn't come to any clear conclusions, but it did say that more research shouldn't be done at the site because of environmental factors that could affect the safety of the researchers and the integrity of the research. The parts that were made public did not mention the team's audio recordings. But in 2001, a former technician who worked on the project told a paranormal research publication that their equipment had picked up what he called organized patterns in the ambient sound of the hollow. Patterns that shouldn't have been there, according to conventional acoustics. When asked for more information, he only said that the patterns made it seem like they were waiting. There are a few mentions of the hollow in local histories of the Ozark region that go back before Europeans settled there. Oral traditions collected from Native Americans in the late 1800s talk about a place where the trees do not speak to each other and where the silence has hunger. Early French trappers are said to have called it Lee, Val qui écoute, which means the valley that listens. The journal of a Methodist circuit rider named Ezekiel Harmon, who traveled through southern Missouri in the 1,820 seconds, may have the earliest record of a European visiting the site. In an entry from August 1823, he wrote about camping near a strange dip in the hills, where no birds sing and where the night seems to press unusually close. He said that he woke up before dawn with the strong feeling that someone had been calling his present name, even though his traveling companions had not heard anything. During the 19th century, local newspapers sometimes ran short stories about hunters or trappers who went missing nearby. Most of the time, these people went missing because of accidents, exposure, or fights with hostile native people. But when you look closely at these events, you can see that they cluster in certain areas, which doesn't seem to be a coincidence when you compare them to what we know about the hollow's boundaries today. The Keller homestead case is probably the most interesting. Friedrich Keller, a German immigrant, started a small farm in 1879 on the eastern edge of what would later be called Stillwater Hollow. County records show that he bought the land for a very low price because the previous owner wanted to sell it for reasons that are not clear in the records. Keller, his wife Margaret, and their 3 grown sons worked the land for 2 years. Everyone says they worked hard and stayed to themselves. The only people they talked to on a regular basis were the people at the general store in the nearest settlement, where they traded extra crops for things they couldn't make themselves. In the spring of 1881, the owner of that store got some neighbors together to check on the Kellers because he was worried about their strange absence. They found a farm that was in great shape. The fields had just been plowed, the animals were well cared for, the house was clean and organized, but there were no people there. The family had left half-eaten meals on the table, made their beds, and left their 2 horses in their stable. But there was no sign of any of the 5 Kellers. The investigation that followed didn't turn up much. There were no signs of violence, theft, or a quick exit. The sheriff's report said that the strangest thing they found was dozens of small stone cairns in the woods behind the house. They were arranged in circles around a limestone outcropping. When the cairns were taken apart, nothing was found underneath them. There was a lot of talk in the area about the Keller disappearance, but no one ever came up with a clear answer. The property stayed empty after that, even though it looked like it could be farmed. By the end of the century, the forest had taken back the fields, and the house slowly fell apart. In less than a generation, there was little sign that anyone had ever tried to live there. It's interesting to note that Thomas Holloway's journal has a short note about finding the remains of an old homestead while he was doing survey work. He noticed the strange arrangement of stone cairns that were still visible in the woods nearby and said that they looked like they had been put there on purpose. According to some organizational principle I cannot discern. He took several soil samples from the area, planning to study them when he got back. Like Holloway himself, these samples vanished into the mystery of Stillwater Hollow. The geological history of the area might help explain the things that happen around the hollow. The Ozarks are one of the oldest land surfaces in North America. Some parts of them have been above sea level for more than 300 million years. When ancient seas covered the area, they left behind the calcium-rich remains of marine organisms that eventually turned into stone. These limestone formations are the most common type of rock in the area. The limestone in Stillwater Hollow may be one of a kind because of how it formed. Geologists who have looked at core samples from the area, but not specifically from the hollow itself, have found strange mineral inclusions and crystalline structures that suggest that hydrothermal vents were present when the rocks were forming. It is possible that these old hot springs added rare earth elements and minerals to the calcium carbonate matrix of the limestone as it was forming, which could have given the stone unique physical properties. In a 1995 paper that didn't name the hollow directly but made vague references to it, a geophysicist put forth a speculative theory that certain crystalline structures might be able to store and release vibrational energy in ways that conventional physics doesn't fully understand. The scientific community largely rejected the paper, and its author later disavowed it, saying that parts of it had been misinterpreted and that he had never meant to suggest anything beyond normal geological processes. Folklore from the area also gives its own reasons for the hollow's strange qualities. Folklorists in the early 20th century recorded a story that has been told many times. It is about a tribal shaman who tried to talk to what dwells beneath the world through rituals done in the hollow long before Europeans arrived. The story says that the shaman was able to do it, but he wasn't ready for what answered his call. The hollow's silence doesn't mean there's nothing there. It means something came out of the stone and has stayed there, listening and sometimes calling out to people who go too far into its territory. There have also been more practical explanations put forward. The hollow's unique geography may have caused rare atmospheric conditions that led to the unusual sound properties. These conditions include temperature inversions, changes in air density, and the specific shapes of the limestone formations, which acousticians call sonic anomalies. Visitors reported psychological effects may be linked to low-frequency infrasound, which research indicates can provoke anxiety, disorientation, and even visual hallucinations in certain individuals. Natural explanations, however, find it difficult to elucidate the persistent pattern of disappearances and psychological decline linked to the site over an extensive period exceeding a century. If only geological or atmospheric events cause the changes, we should see the same effects in other places with similar features. The distinctiveness of the hollow's impact indicates a singular characteristic of that specific locale. Dr. Rebecca Lansing, a researcher at the University of Colorado, tried to make a complete timeline of events related to Stillwater Hollow in 1975. She used both official records and stories from people who lived in the area. Her work, which was never officially published but is still in the university's archives, found at least 27 documented disappearances in the area between 1,823 and 1,968. It also found many reports of people who spent time in the hollow but came out physically intact but with changed personalities. Lansing's research was halted when university officials stopped funding her project, saying they didn't have enough money. In a letter to a coworker that was later found among her papers, she said she was upset about this choice and that she had started to notice strange patterns in the Hollow's activity over time. She wrote, "The incidents seem to happen in groups every 30 years, with times of relative calm in between. If this pattern holds, the Hollow is entering another active phase." Shortly after that, Lansing moved to California and refused to talk more about her research when other investigators tried to reach her. But in her personal notes, she talks about dreams where she heard voices from stone calling her back to the Hollow. In her last recorded comment on the subject, she wrote, "Some things that were once known cannot be unknown. Some places never forget once they know you." After 1968, the historical record becomes more and more broken up. The area was officially called a restricted research zone, which made it hard to get official records. In Forestry Service incident reports, there are occasional mentions of rangers coming across hikers who seem lost or overly anxious after wandering near the Hollow's unmarked boundaries. Internal memos talk about how important it is to keep up and sometimes add to signs warning of unstable ground. These official reports don't include the stories that people in the area still tell each other. Families in the nearby towns keep their own oral histories of the Hollow, passing down warnings from one generation to the next. People in the Ozarks don't often share these stories with people from outside the area because they have learned the hard way that their worries are often dismissed as superstition or rural paranoia. Walter Simmons, who lived in Stone County his whole life and worked as a guide for hunting parties from the 1,950 seconds to the 1,990 seconds, gave a rare interview to a folklorist in 1988. Simmons, who was in his 70s at the time, talked about an experience he had in the fall of 1977 when he was leading a group of deer hunters from Kansas City. He said that the party accidentally got too close to the edges of Stillwater Hollow late in the afternoon when the sun was setting. Simmons said, "I knew exactly where we were and that we needed to turn back, but before I could say anything, one of the guys stopped and tilted his head like he was listening to something. Then he said, 'Did you hear that? Someone's calling my name.' None of the rest of us heard anything." The woods were dead quiet, like they always are around that place, like the air is too thick for sound to travel right. Simmons said that the man started walking toward the Hollow, even though the group told him not to. He said he heard someone calling for help. Simmons remembered, "The way he was moving wasn't right. It was like he was being pulled forward. His eyes were blank. We had to physically hold him back. It took 3 grown men to do it. He fought us hard, then suddenly went limp. When he came back to himself, he didn't remember what had happened. He said he felt like he had been dreaming, but he couldn't remember what." Simmons said that these kinds of things happened fairly often, but they weren't always reported to the police. He said, "People around here know to stay away. It's the outsiders who get into trouble. They listen to warnings sometimes, and not others. The ones who don't, well, not all of them come back out." After the 1973 USGS study, it seemed like there was less formal scientific interest in Stillwater Hollow. This could have happened because the Forestry Service didn't let people in, or it could have been because researchers thought the Hollow was a bad place to work. Being connected to the site had ruined academic careers. Getting money for related research was hard, and the phenomena didn't fit into standard analysis, making it an unappealing topic for serious scientific research. In the early 1990 seconds, though, this changed a little when new theoretical frameworks came out in quantum physics and consciousness studies. Dr. Malcolm Blackwood, a theoretical physicist at MIT, who was interested in what he called anomalous consciousness-environment interactions, learned about the Hollow while reading about declassified government research on sound phenomena. Blackwood was very careful in his approach. Instead of going to the site himself, he did a meta-analysis of all the available documents, looking for patterns that could be explained by new ideas about quantum coherence in living systems. He wrote a paper in 1994 for a little-known interdisciplinary journal in which he suggested that the limestone formations in the Hollow might have strange quantum properties that could interact with the quantum parts of human consciousness. He wrote, "Some crystalline structures, especially those that form under very high temperatures and pressures, may show quantum entanglement properties across large distances. If the human brain uses quantum effects in consciousness, as some researchers suggest, then it is at least theoretically possible for these geological formations to interact with neural quantum states, which could lead to what people might think of as telepathic or psychic phenomena. The paper didn't get much attention from mainstream scientists, but it did lead a group of parapsychological researchers to try to go to Stillwater Hollow in the summer of 1995. Their request for a permit from the Forestry Service was turned down, officially because of concerns about the environment. According to a leaked internal memo, the decision was unofficially influenced by the advice of a psychological consultant who looked over the group's proposal and said, "Previous patterns suggest a high risk of adverse psychological outcomes for participants in the study." Two members of the group, Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist, and Marcus Weathers, a sound engineer, are said to have entered the restricted area without permission in August of that year, even though they were told not to. A Forestry Service ranger who saw them leaving the area wrote a report saying they looked confused but were not hurt. When asked why they were in a restricted area, they said they had gotten lost while hiking a trail that was open to the public several miles away. The official story doesn't include the statement that Weathers later gave to a newsletter about paranormal research, which described what really happened to them in the hollow. This story says that the two researchers brought high-tech recording equipment that could pick up both regular sound waves and electromagnetic changes. They set up this equipment close to the Whispering Wall formation and ran a number of tests for about 6 hours. Weathers said, "The data we gathered was unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of acoustic research. The frequency distributions showed patterns that shouldn't happen naturally. When we did spectral analyses, we found what looked like modulations in the background noise changes that happened in rhythmic sequences that were like language patterns, but weren't like any human language." Weathers said that what happened when they tried to use the hollow's sound properties to make their own voices louder was even more disturbing. "We did a lot of echo tests, recording our voices as they bounced off the limestone face. When we played back the recordings, we heard sounds that weren't in our original voices. It was like something was adding to our voices as they bounced back." Dr. Chen never said anything about these claims in public. She quit her job at the university soon after getting back from the trip, and it's said that she moved to New Zealand. Colleagues tried to get in touch with her about the Stillwater research, but they were not able to. Weathers kept his interest in the hollow for several years and tried to plan another trip there, but he couldn't get the money or the permits he needed. In 2001, he wrote a short article that went against what he had said before, saying that his claims were due to broken equipment and the power of suggestion in a place known for making up stories. The most recent chapter in the recorded history of Stillwater Hollow began in 2002 when the Forestry Service began a full environmental assessment of the Mark Twain National Forest, which included the restricted area around the hollow. Federal rules required this assessment, which involved teams of biologists, geologists, and environmental scientists making a list of the different species, geological features, and possible environmental risks in the forest. The first survey team that went to the hollow was made up of 4 researchers: Dr. James Harrington, a geologist; Dr. Elena Vasquez, a botanist; Michael Reeves, an environmental science technician; and Tasha Williams, a graduate student in ecology who was helping with the research. The official schedule said that the team would spend 5 days doing a basic assessment of the area, mostly by cataloging plant species and collecting soil samples for analysis. They lost radio contact with the team on the 2nd day of their survey. A ranger sent to their last known location found their camp intact, but empty. A search operation began right away, and more people were brought in from nearby districts to help. After 3 days of intense searching, Reeves and Williams were found about 8 miles from their camp, walking along a Forestry Service road in what was described as a confused state. They couldn't remember how they had gotten separated from the other team members, or how they had traveled so far from where they had started. The next day, they found Dr. Harrington sitting still at the bottom of a limestone outcropping deep in the hollow. The report says that he didn't respond to verbal cues, but he wasn't hurt. When medical staff tried to move him, he got upset and kept pointing at the rock face and saying, "It's in there. It's always been in there." It wants to come out. A helicopter took him to a hospital in Springfield, where he was diagnosed with acute stress disorder and temporary cognitive impairment. Even though the search for Dr. Vasquez was one of the biggest in the history of the Mark Twain National Forest, they never found him. The official report said that she probably fell into one of the many sinkholes or cave openings that are common in the karst landscape of the area. Even though her body was never found, the case was ruled as a presumed accidental death. The official documents don't include the contents of Dr. Harrington's personal field journal, which was one of the things that the team found at their camp. Some parts of this journal were later given to a reporter from the Springfield News Leader without revealing who wrote them. The things that were written in it were very similar to what other researchers had written since Thomas Holloway in 1908. Harrington had noticed strange acoustic properties in the hollow. He said that some sounds seemed to disappear, while others were louder than they should have been. He wrote down how the team was getting more and more uneasy, especially when they turned off their equipment and were quiet. He wrote, "The silence here is very wrong. It feels like it's judging me, like I'm listening with a purpose." Harrington's last entry was the most important. It was about what he called a breakthrough in understanding the hollow. "The limestone isn't just reflecting sound," he wrote. "It's processing it. The crystalline matrices are like a simple brain, storing, analyzing, and eventually copying the sounds it hears. It learns from what it hears. It's been learning for millions of years. The question isn't what's in the hollow. The hollow itself is the entity we've been sensing, and I think it's getting better at communicating." The Forestry Service acted quickly and thoroughly in response to the incident. The environmental assessment of the hollow was put on hold for an unknown amount of time. More signs and more ranger patrols around the perimeter made it clear that the area was off limits. FOIA requests later revealed that there were talks about possibly fencing off the whole area, but this idea was ultimately turned down because of the cost and the risk of drawing unwanted attention. After a few weeks of treatment, Dr. Harrington was released from the hospital and went back to work at the University of Missouri. Colleagues said that he seemed like a different person after what happened. He was more withdrawn, often distracted, and spent long hours in the university's geology lab looking at limestone samples from different Ozark locations, but not from Stillwater Hollow itself. He said no to all requests to talk about the incident because he had signed a confidentiality agreement with the Forestry Service. It's ironic that the very things that are trying to limit access to and information about Stillwater Hollow have helped make it more of an internet legend. Starting around 2005, online forums that talked about paranormal events and unsolved mysteries started sharing stories about the Ozarks' Haunted Valley or Whispering Woods. These stories, which are often very exaggerated and include parts from legends that have nothing to do with them, still have bits of real history in them. The Hollow has become a dark tourism spot for some thrill seekers and people who are interested in the paranormal. Most people don't go because the rules are clear and the Ozark terrain is hard to get around. Rangers usually stop people who try to get to the site long before they get close to its borders. But sometimes, even with these precautions, people still go missing nearby. From 2006 to 2018, local sheriff's departments reported 7 people who went missing in areas near the hollow. 5 were eventually solved, with the people found alive, but usually confused and with little memory of what happened to them. There are still 2 open cases, and the people who went missing have not been found, despite a lot of searching. Jason Merrick, a college student, was one of the people whose case was solved. In 2010, he read about the silence on a paranormal website and decided to look into it. Merrick told his friends that he was going to record the hollow's supposed strange sounds for a sound design class project. His friends reported him missing after he didn't come back after 3 days. Search teams found his car parked at the start of a trail about 5 miles from the hollow's edge. He was missing his camping gear and recording equipment, which means he probably left on foot as planned. Merrick was found by a volunteer search team member after a long and difficult 4-day search that was made worse by unusually bad weather. He was sitting against a tree at the edge of a clearing, staring at a limestone outcropping. He set up his recording gear in a half circle around the rock face. When people asked him about it, he acknowledged them but couldn't or wouldn't say what had happened or how long he had been there. After being taken back to civilization, Merrick was checked out by a doctor who found no physical injuries but did see signs of sleep deprivation and mild dehydration. When authorities asked him about what happened, he gave them incomplete and contradictory answers. Sometimes he said he got lost, and other times he said he found exactly what he was looking for but couldn't explain it well. The sheriff's department looked at Merrick's recording equipment and then gave it back to him. When asked what he had recorded in the hollow, Merrick reportedly only said, "Nothing you could hear by listening to the recordings. It doesn't work that way." He didn't want to say anything else. After he came back, friends and family noticed small but consistent changes in Merrick's behavior and personality over the next few months. He cut ties with a lot of people, switched his major from sound design to geology, and spent more and more time in the Ozarks' remote areas, but he never went back to the hollow itself. People who talk about the hollow on online forums sometimes say they have seen Merrick while exploring the area themselves. These stories say that he gave people strange warnings about listening too closely and told them to trust the silence but never answer when it calls your name. The most recent confirmed event linked to Stillwater Hollow happened in the spring of 2017 when a Forestry Service ranger named Daniel Matt went missing while on a routine patrol of the hollow's edge. The official report says that Matt had worked in the district for more than 15 years and knew all about the hollow's restricted status and how to keep an eye on its borders. Colleagues said he was experienced, calm, and very familiar with the area. At the start of his patrol, Matt called in and said everything was normal and that it would take about 4 hours to walk around the perimeter of the restricted zone. His boss tried to get in touch with him when he didn't check in at the right time, but he didn't answer. Because of the hollow's past, a search was started right away. Tracking dogs brought to Matt's last known location acted in the same strange way that reports from the search for Thomas Holloway in 1908 described. They got excited at first, then confused, circled back on their own trail, and finally sat down and refused to continue even when the handler urged them to. After 3 days of searching hard, Matt was found about 2 miles inside the hollow's boundaries, far outside the area he had been told to patrol. He was sitting on a fallen log and staring at a limestone outcropping that looked like the Whispering Wall, which is a formation that has been around for a long time. His radio was broken and lying on the ground next to him, with its parts arranged in a precise geometric pattern. When members of the search team talked to him, he only gave them one-word answers that didn't seem to have anything to do with what they were asking. Matt was taken to a hospital, where doctors diagnosed him with acute dissociative disorder of unknown etiology. Over the next few weeks, he slowly regained the ability to communicate, but he said he didn't remember how he got into the hollow or what he did there. When investigators from the Forestry Service asked him questions, he got upset and kept saying, "It knows we're listening. It's learning how to speak." Matt was released from medical care after 6 weeks of treatment and evaluation, but he did not go back to work for the Forestry Service. Former co-workers who kept in touch with him say he moved to the Pacific Northwest, which is as far from the Ozarks as possible while still being in the contiguous United States. He has always turned down requests for interviews about his experience, saying that he is worried about medical privacy and the terms of his separation agreement with the Forestry Service. A journalist's 2018 FOIA request for internal documents from a later review of the incident by the Forestry Service shows that senior administrators were very worried about the pattern of incidents related to the hollow. One memo from a regional supervisor says, "The consistency of psychological effects over a period of more than a century suggests an environmental factor that remains unidentified despite multiple scientific investigations. Until this factor can be isolated and mitigated, the current access restrictions should not only be maintained but reinforced." Another document talks about plans for more thorough monitoring of the hollow, including the use of remote sensing technologies that would allow data collection without people having to be in the affected area. It is still not clear if these plans have been put into action. Stillwater Hollow is still officially a restricted research natural area, which means that the public can't go there, but the government doesn't have to say anything about the strange things that happen there. The Forestry Service maps still show the area with the vague note, "Unstable terrain, survey incomplete." Rangers who work in the district get special briefings about the hollow, but the information in these briefings is not available to the public. The oral history that has been passed down through generations of Ozark families is what lasts beyond the official records and rules. For years, these stories have warned about the place where the silence listens. They say that if you're walking in the deep woods and suddenly realize the birds have stopped singing, you should turn around right away and go back the way you came. They say that if you hear someone calling your name from further into the woods, you should never answer or follow them, especially if the voice sounds like someone you know. These warnings have kept generations of people who live nearby from being affected by the hollow. It's people from outside the area, scientists, researchers, and thrill seekers who are still drawn to the mystery, often with tragic results. Rangers stopped a group of college students from getting to the hollow with recording equipment and camping gear as recently as the summer of 2018. When asked, they said they were making a documentary for a streaming service about America's most haunted forest. They didn't know about the site's documented history of disappearances because they thought it was just another internet legend that could be used for profit. The Rangers took their gear, gave them tickets for trying to enter a restricted area, and then drove them back to their cars before letting them go. According to reports, the head ranger said, "Whatever you think you're looking for in there, it's not worth finding. Some things once known can't be unknown. Some places, once they know you, never forget." The hollow is still waiting, just like it always has. People who live there say that the silence listens, and sometimes even speaks, using voices that sound almost like those of people who have gone there alone and never come back. So if you're hiking in the remote backcountry of the Mark Twain National Forest, and the birds stop singing and the air gets thick with silence that seems to press against your eardrums, turn back. And if you hear someone calling your name in that silence, with a voice that sounds familiar but not quite right, don't answer, don't follow, and most importantly, don't pay too much attention to what it might be trying to say. The silence in those woods has had more than 100 years to learn how to use human voices and has had a lot of practice.